Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we do still have a couple of people joining in, so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jessica Stenclift, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Accudata Systems. We appreciate your time and welcome to our PCI QSA Open Forum webinar. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, because this is a live Q&A, please feel free to start asking your questions immediately in the chat window in your browser. We did receive 3 questions during the registration process, so we'll address those first and then open up the floor. If we're unable to get to your question today, our QSAs will be emailing you individually after the webinar to answer those questions. Please allow 48 to 72 hours for those responses. After the webinar, each attendee will receive a post-event email that includes both the full recorded webinar as well as additional PCI resources that should help you on your path to compliance. Today, we're joined by 2 extremely knowledgeable experts who are here to help address your toughest challenges around maintaining PCI compliance. So first, I'd like to welcome Anton Abaya. Anton is one of our PCI QSAs and is a risk and compliance consultant at Accudata. He has more than 14 years of experience in IT security, audit, compliance, operations, and consulting. Anton has performed numerous services for many public and private organizations in the aerospace and research, banking and finance, healthcare, higher education, retail, and technology industries. And those organizations range from Fortune 1000 firms to Fortune 50. We're also pleased to welcome Ismail Alfaro. Ismail is a risk and compliance professional services manager and solutions architect at Accudata. As a QSA, Ismail oversees all aspects of service delivery and customer satisfaction for the risk and compliance team. Before joining Accudata, he spent 8 years building and maturing a security program for a Fortune 300 retailer and brings more than 15 years of security experience to our team. Since joining Accudata, he has worked on projects to meet HIPAA and PCI compliance, performed technical assessments, and advised clients on how to increase their information security programs and reduce risk to critical systems and data. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our live Q&A. Remember, keep those questions coming in the Q&A chat box, and we'll certainly try to get to as many as we can in the next 30 minutes. So our first question is for Ismail. How do you manage vendors and contractors when it comes to PCI compliance?
Hey, thanks, Jessica. And just to all the participants, we thank you for joining us today. Look forward to your questions and answering those, starting with this one. So vendor management and service provider management. This is one where we see merchants can get tripped up a little bit just because there's typically not a well-defined program for vendor management. And so when we talk about how do you manage vendors, it really just comes down to a simple approach of just making sure when you're engaging with service providers before the contracts are actually written and signed that you are considering your compliance impact. You're going to want to make sure that the agreements for what the service provider is providing in the way of what requirements they're addressing are spelled out clearly. You're going to want to set expectations that you are going to be following up on their compliance on an annual basis as part of your risk management program. And you're just going to want to make sure that the contracts are just, they consider all of the PCI requirements that for tracking and monitoring and assessing your vendor's compliance. Where things get a little tricky is where maybe this process isn't well defined out up front, and a lot of contracts get signed, and IT either isn't, or whoever is responsible for compliance isn't brought into the loop. And so now you are kind of working backwards to discover who your service providers are, what services they're providing to you, how they impact your compliance program, and so that becomes a much more difficult process. We have seen some engagements where this has been the case, and it's really delayed getting a report on compliance delivered just because it takes so much time to not only identify who the service providers are and what touch points they have into the network, but also getting them to sit down and work with legal to redefine contracts, redefine agreements, and all those things just take a lot of time. So right out of the gate, we want to encourage you, inspire you to have a pre-contract kind of approach. But if you have found yourself into the latter where maybe it just hasn't been done yet, really just take it on a case-by-case basis and perform your risk, perform a risk management and risk assessment against those service providers, and get those all shored up.
Great, thanks, Ismail. Is there anything you'd like to add, Anton?
Sure, and before I start, I just wanted to say welcome to everyone as well, and thank you for your participation. So Ismail pretty much answered all the good points there. I wanted to add a couple points, though. I think when it comes to service providers, again, kind of echoing what he said, having a really good vendor due diligence process prior to signing that contract is great. Even if you have to work backwards for any existing relationships, just having that process in place and nailed down will really save you in the end. Now, you're probably thinking, where do I start with that? There is a really good PCI guidance document for vendor due diligence. It's called PCI Third-Party Security Assurance. You can actually Google that one, PCI Third-Party Security Assurance, and that'll be the first link on the PCI website. That's a good place to start for a vendor due diligence program. Now, the last point I wanted to make was that really getting to know what these service providers do for you. How are they involved with credit cards? Are they storing it? Are they processing it? Are they transmitting it? And how, or actually, how can they impact the security of your card data environment? Some people miss this a lot. So say a firewall managed services provider, right, where they manage your firewalls for you or maybe manage your logs for you. They're not necessarily in the flow of credit card numbers, but they still play a critical role to protecting the security of your card data environment. So there could be service providers like that that you'd also have to think about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anton. All right, we'll go ahead and head on to our second question then. This question is geared toward Anton. So once your company receives the P2PE certification, is the QSA required to perform a preliminary review and assessment to confirm that the area covered by P2PE is no longer in scope for PCI?
That's a good question. So the entire point of P2PE, point-to-point encryption, is to simplify things for PCI because of just how secure that technology is. But let me try to clear a few things up with a question. So a merchant or service provider entity that's trying to become PCI compliant typically does not need to obtain a P2PE certification, or more accurately said, P2PE validation. This validation is more for P2PE solution vendors or providers that sell or offer these products. And the validation for that is performed by a special QSA called a P2PE QSA, not a PCI QSA. Ismail and I are PCI QSAs. Now, if a merchant or service provider is seeking to reduce PCI scope through the deployment of P2PE technologies, what they need to do is deploy a listed P2PE validated solution. And these solutions, they come from different vendors, are actually listed on the PCI website. If you Google PCI P2PE validated solutions, that's on, that's the first link. Now, if you deploy one of these listed or validated P2PE solutions, you don't need a P2PE QSA to certify your installation or your deployment, but you may still need a PCI QSA to validate your compliance, say if you're large enough, such as with a level 2 and level 1 merchants. And make sure your P2PE deployment truly replaced all use cases involving credit cards. For example, a restaurant might deploy P2PE devices across all of their restaurants, but there's sometimes restaurants will take card not present orders, say reservations or for banquets, that sort of thing, and you need to make sure that P2PE also solved that use case. Now, since you've massively reduced your PCI scope with P2PE technology, the PCI QSA's validation process will be much smaller and a much smaller engagement. We've had many customers in the past 2 years, in fact, that have been able to find P2PE solutions on this list from the PCI Council that worked in their environment and vastly reduced PCI compliance obligations, scope, and assessment costs, for that matter. Now, in very rare instances, there are some hybrid merchant-managed P2PE solutions. What that means is these are organizations that have the ability to decrypt the cardholder data coming from their P2PE devices. In these cases, it is highly recommended that P2PE QSAs evaluate your unique deployment and obviously work closely with your PCI QSA as well. Now, if your environment cannot support one of these listed P2PE solutions that's on the PCI website, or you've already deployed one that's not listed, and you're not sure if your vendor is going to list themselves eventually, really step one is you should engage your acquiring bank for their guidance. They will tell you if they have an opinion or not on your P2PE setup or deployment or vendor. But in many cases, they'll actually ask you to reach out to your PCI QSA anyway, again, if you're large enough. Now, very close to step one is to ask your non-validated P2PE solution provider for what's called a NESA document. NESA stands for Non-Validated Encryption Solution Assessment, or a similar document where P2PE QSA reviewed that solution, that non-listed solution. In those documents, you will typically see defined by the P2PE QSA what the PCI scope will be for an entity using a non-validated solution. Unfortunately, we've actually seen some documents like this where the report, the assessment report, pretty much said that the majority of the PCI requirements are still in scope and apply to the workstations connected to the P2PE environment. So it's really very important to read this document, ideally before you buy.
Thanks, Anton. Ismail, anything you'd like to add there?
Sure, yeah, just to Anton's point, go with the approved PCI listed P2PE solution where possible. And keep in mind that there is a separate listing for approved PIN transaction solution devices, the actual devices where the card is being dipped or swiped. There is a listing of those approved devices as well. So we have seen use cases where a customer has gone with an approved P2PE solution, but however had not gone with a approved PTS device solution, and it caused some headaches. So just make sure you're following up on those approved listings for the P2PE solution as well as the PIN transaction devices themselves.
Great. Thank you both so much for such a detailed answer. All right, we'll move on to the last question that was asked during the registration process here. So in terms of Type D SAQs, since every device is in scope, does this require a pen test for every site, or can sampling play a factor? And this one is going to go to Ismail.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So whenever I read every device in scope, it just gives me a QSA, spidey sense going off. It makes me a little nervous. So I guess my first reaction to this question is, or the advice I would give to this question is, so every device in scope, the first thing I would want to do is, well, does every device truly have to be in scope? Have we gone through some scope reduction type methodologies or practices that we can reduce that scope down so that we don't have to consider every device as in scope? Things like we've already mentioned point-to-point encryption. There are solutions for e-commerce environments where you can reduce scope through redirection to payment gateways. There are network segmentation, which is probably the most familiar to everybody, all the participants on the call today, the network segmentation practices of creating an isolated, secure PCI zone away from everything else to try to segment off a portion of the network for just your hardware-data systems. But let's assume none of those things can or have been done, and every device is in scope. So the question is, do I have to pen test every site, or can I sample? So the answer is yes, you have to pen test. Every device is in scope, and yes, the entire environment must be pen tested. So you do have to consider, if you have all of those devices, all of those sites, all those places that are part of your cardholder data processing networks, then they are subject to the requirements for pen testing. Now, where we can consider some sampling, is where if we have representative samples of sites that have the same technologies, the same type of access control devices, the firewalls, routers, workstations, servers, all those configurations are all the same. It's site 1 to site 2 all the way to site X. All of those sites maintain a uniformity of technology, then we can perform penetration testing on a sampling of those representative sites. Now, where you don't want to confuse the two is on your vulnerability scans, because you cannot sample when performing vulnerability scans. You're still going to want to scan your entire environment. You can't sample there. But for representative sampling, you can perform some penetration testing of just those sites that have same configurations. But to reiterate, let's go back to PCI best practices and let's reduce the scope. That's where we really need to focus our efforts so that number one, the burden of trying to achieve and maintain maintain compliance over an environment of that size, depending on the size of this merchant. If it's a rather large merchant, you could be talking about thousands of devices or more. Keeping up with the compliance program in that kind of environment is very difficult. So scope reducing methodologies. Go ahead, Anton. I thought you were about to say something.
I think it was Jessica, but let me. I was going to add to what you said, and I think you answered it great. Representative sampling is permitted for penetration tests. Now there are actually. What I wanted to say was that reducing scope is also very important, but sometimes reducing scope is a multi-month, sometimes multi-year project, and you still need to do a penetration test, while things are being remediated, right, as you're reducing scope. And you might get to this uncomfortable state of where your penetration test is just overly complex, maybe very large, very expensive, and will never be approved by management because it's, again, the expense. I'd say, again, also go back to step one, try to reduce scope and try to find ways to reduce the scope of your penetration test through, again, representative sampling. This is a point where you can probably talk directly to a QSA and ask them for some, kind of more detailed guidance about your environment, and maybe there are other unique strategies that we haven't mentioned as well.
Great. Thank you both so much for such detailed answers. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and open it up to the attendees today and their questions. Our first question is going to be for Anton. Do you have any recommendations to fully outsource card payments and processing to third-party service providers?
Sure. It's a good question again. So it's important to understand that the more you outsource, the more PCI goes away, and I think that's really what you're getting at with the question. But just so you know, PCI never really reaches absolute zero. Sometimes outsourcing can also have its own costs, such as per transaction costs. Usually service providers will increase your per transaction costs. You also have a lack of control over the process or the look and feel, sometimes of your website, during the payment transaction process, or where your data, sensitive data, credit card numbers, that sort of thing, or business is potentially, quote unquote, held hostage by service providers. These are risks that do exist when you fully outsource. They can be mitigated, of course. Now, having said that, we've seen customers certainly do this very successfully, outsource very successfully, and what used to be a big annual PCI spend and headache, for that matter, became much easier. In those instances, it was still actually very interesting to see that some of these customers that have fully outsourced still maintained a lot of the PCI requirements for their old systems after outsourcing anyway, because they figured it was best practice and had spent all that effort to get there. Now, to fully outsource, credit card payments to a third-party provider, there's really two main strategies right now for e-commerce environments. What you're looking for is either a hosting provider, e-commerce hosting provider that just fully manages everything. Ideally, something where or a service provider that even uses their own merchant account, and you have sort of a kind of trusted accounting process with them, where they kind of pay you a check, at the end of the month, every week or something like that, for any revenues minus their cut, of course. Now, what's common nowadays is, websites will also kind of want to maintain the look and feel of their own websites, but they want to maybe fully outsource the payment process itself. Our recommendation there is to look to using iframes or full redirects to service providers that can that offer that iframes or full redirects. Some of them will even customize the iframe or the full redirect so that it still kind of looks and feels like your website, even though it's a complete transfer to their side. Obviously, uptime is obviously a concern there if you maintain a website with a lot of e-commerce activity going on. Point-to-point encryption is another way to outsource a lot of your card-present transactions, sometimes even card-not-present, such as over-the-phone orders. And by doing so, you can de-scope a lot of your point-of-sale applications and even your workstations if you have that technology in place. Now, my final kind of guidance there, too, is take a look at the Visa service provider list. You can actually Google that one, Visa PCI service provider list. And they have a list of all the approved service providers that have gone through a rigorous kind of application process with Visa to be listed there. One of them is that they proved that they're PCI compliant. Also, ask your acquirer for guidance or recommendations for service providers. Sometimes the acquirer has partnerships or they actually sell that service themselves or have an offering. And then final note is whatever service providers you evaluate, you're going to fully outsource to, always ask for their PCI attestations of compliance. Make sure that they are willing to sign written agreements that say they will safeguard cardholder data in their possession prior to signing that service contract with them. Consider even putting T's and C's on the contract on what will happen if they do not maintain their compliance. Sometimes that happens, especially when service providers get acquired by other larger service providers. Sometimes they don't maintain compliance as well. And have a backup plan just in case that service provider relationship changes and their compliance changes. Maybe have a backup service provider always in your back pocket.
Thanks, Anton. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Ismail?
I think Anton hit it perfectly. He covered the things that are the two areas that I was really going to focus on. So, yeah, great job.
Okay.
Nothing to add.
Fantastic. So then we'll go ahead and go on to the next question. And this one will be for Ismail. So currently our ERP system is in scope for PCI. It only obtains the credit card token and does not have any raw card data. Should the ERP still remain in scope, although no raw card data does exist?
Okay, yeah, great question. So I actually have a client that's kind of in this very same situation. So to answer the question, let me just start with the definition of in-scope systems per the DSS. As a refresher, I'm sure we all know, but just to state it, these are systems that if it's in scope if it stores, transmits, or processes credit cardholder data, or it's connected to systems that store, transmit, or process cardholder data, or it's a system that can impact the security of the cardholder data environment. So that's how we land at scope. So it could be that this ERP system is getting a token of the card itself, but perhaps it could be connected to the same network where one of the cardholder data systems are connected. So to answer this question, I would really have to understand really the cardholder data flow and how the network is kind of set up. I can say this, if this ERP system is isolated and it's not connected to the CDE in any kind of way and it's only receiving that token and we can validate that, then I would feel comfortable with saying that this is not directly in the scope of a cardholder data processing system, but potentially could be a side scope system. It really just comes down to how the cardholder data is flowing, how that token is making its way to the ERP, and how the network is architected. So I know that probably isn't the silver bullet answer that this participant may have been looking for. It's kind of a gray area just because there are some areas of unknown. The token itself, I guess I could say the token itself being on that system does not in and of itself remove that system from the scope of PCI. And if you're engaged in a PCI assessment right now and you have a QSA telling you the system is in scope and just because it has a token, it could be that because of the way the cardholder data is flowing and how the network is architected, it could be the reason why the QSA is still considering the system in scope. I want to kick this over to Anton to get his feedback to see what he may be able to chime in on as well.
Ismail, I think that was a great answer. I think knowing connectivity between the ERP system and the cardholder data environment where credit cards are truly stored, processed, or transmitted is very important before we can de-scope the system. Having said all that, when we're storing credit card tokens in an ERP system, I think the intent behind all that was to de-scope the ERP system altogether, right? And right. There are strategies to make sure that there are ways to test and validate to make sure of that, right? And if that is the intent of the person asking the question, there is a way to make sure that ERP system is completely out of scope if it's only receiving credit card tokens, right? And I've actually done that. I had a customer who did exactly that. They previously stored credit card numbers and on their ERP system. It was previously in the flow of credit cards. And they went through this exercise of putting tokenization technologies in place so that only tokens will be stored there. If that was something that if your ERP system used to store credit card numbers, one thing I'll tell you is to go through a very thorough exercise of looking for any old credit cards that might still be lingering in the ERP system. Use some tools to scan for unencrypted credit card numbers and use manual querying of all the tables or the databases to make sure that even encrypted credit card numbers are no longer stored there. Once that's all been cleared, you can then obviously potentially de-scope that ERP system. And you're certainly well positioned for it if all you're storing moving forward are credit card tokens.
Great answers. Thank you both. We'll go ahead and we have time for one more question here before we reach the top of the hour. So that question is going to be directed toward Anton, and it is, what is the best method or matrix to follow when doing risk management and building risk management policies?
That's a great question. So when it comes to risk management and risk assessments, really, there's a specific PCI requirement on that. And they actually cite the several risk management and risk assessment frameworks from NIST, from Octave, in that PCI requirement. I think it's PCI 12.2 or 12.3, if I'm not mistaken. So I would start there. Those frameworks will detail, the types of threats and vulnerabilities or risks that you would want to ask about your environment or against your environment. Now, when we perform risk assessments or PCI risk assessments on behalf of our clients, we always start with first really understanding the cardholder data flows across their entire environment, really mapping that out. And then once you know that, you map the technologies that support that environment. And from there, you can now kind of take a look at your risk and threat or vulnerability database, and you can start asking questions. How are we protecting our environment against these risks or these threats? And you list out some of those controls and some of those technologies that you've put in place. Now, some of them might actually map back to the exact PCI requirements that you needed to put in place anyway, and sometimes they don't. A good example would be, RAM credit card scraping malware that you saw in recent breaches at retail outlets. These are, there's no direct PCI requirement that addresses that, and a risk assessment may lead to a conclusion that even though you're PCI compliant, you have all these technologies in place, the risk landscape is just so bad that you need to deploy other better technologies anyway, such as point-to-point encryption, and that there's no way to win that war, right? That, or you might say, you know what, even though we have antivirus, antivirus wasn't detecting these, so maybe what we need to do is deploy application whitelisting technologies on every one of our endpoints. So that's usually the outcome of these risk assessments. And again, just to answer the question, start from a framework as is already recommended in the exact requirement. Final note is there is actually a PCI guidance document. If you actually Google PCI risk assessment guidance, it should be the first link. That's guidance directly from the PCI Council on how you should structure your PCI risk management and risk assessment strategies.
Great answer. Thank you so much. Well, at this point, we've reached the top of the hour. It's 2 o'clock, and we appreciate everyone who joined us today and your questions. If the conversation has spurred any additional questions, feel free to either email your Accudata account manager or give them a call. We'll also be sending out the post-event email that includes the link to the webinar as well as other PCI resources. You can also respond directly to that email address, and we'll be sure to field your questions to the right person on our end. We do appreciate you taking time to join us today and hope that you have a great afternoon. Thank you.